Don't you find it odd that Clark died in the exact same manner as the Tsalal men?
Yes. Incredibly odd. But some questions just don't have answers.
It's not a big surprise that as we get to the end, the main characters in True Detective Night Country weren't asking the right question. To solve the Tsalal case, which turned out to be unambiguously connected to the Annie Kowtowk case, the question wasn't who killed her, but who knew who the killer was. Once they figured that out, the question wasn't what should they do about it, but rather had justice been done. Going into this finale, I heard a lot of concerns. Was one episode enough to answer all the questions the show was asking? And based on what we'd seen, would it have been better if this show was made as its own thing rather than a season of True Detective? I promise I won't spend the whole video comparing Night Country to season 1, but because that was a big question, we need to start there. One of the most memorable moments of the first season was the final scene, which put a fine point on what it was all about. Russ Cole says it's just one story, the oldest, the story of light versus dark, good versus evil, as simple as it comes. And what made it interesting was the light and dark that coexisted inside of the characters. The abuse and the murder were all unequivocally bad, but when it came to the people fighting against it, it was a question of degree. In the final moments, after Marty remarks on the night sky that it looks like the dark has a lot more territory, Rust, who was the more nihilistic of the two throughout the season, and who experienced a shift in perspective after a near-death experience where he faced down evil, says that he's looking at it wrong. In his estimation, once there was only dark. So if you ask him, the light is winning. From the beginning, Night Country had the idea of light versus dark baked into its DNA. Because the show is centered in Arctic Ennis, Alaska, rather than steamy Louisiana, the premiere opened with the final sunset before a period of perpetual darkness. The absence of light is a matter of fact, but the return is also inevitable. It's a cycle that's bigger than the people who experience it, and one that will continue long after their stories are over. And with everything else stripped away, a story being told is the core of True Detective. The series creator, Nick Pizzolatto, has said this in several different interviews, and you can see how he applied that idea to the second and third season. Night Country delivered one of its better callbacks to the first season, with Danvers telling Pete Pryor the story of the William Wheeler case. In the finale, we saw that Navarro was the one to pull the trigger, but Liz admits she was thinking of doing the same thing. The way she told him one thing, and we saw how things actually played out, was a direct reference to Rust and Marty giving testimony about what happened when they went to arrest Reggie Ledoux. In that case, they told a story that freed them from any responsibility because Ledoux was such a bad man that Marty's impulsive act of becoming his judge and executioner seemed just. The other thing about Ledoux, and later the main big bad of that season, Errol Childress, was that they only were able to continue their crimes because of powerful players controlling narratives and obscuring information in the background. The Tuttles, or the Carcosa cult, used their influence to tell a story that obscured the terrible things that they were doing while using their religious schools as fronts. So with all that out of the way, this idea of the indigenous women telling their version of a story about justice for Annie K is what I thought worked best about this finale. The short season, which is what I liked least about Night Country, weirdly worked to force this final installment to focus exclusively on delivering answers, which made it the most propulsive episode since the second one. Did it answer every question? Absolutely not. But leaving some enduring mystery tends to be the smart choice, and in this case, I enjoyed how Liz's conflict with the supernatural puts her in the same place we find ourselves in at the end. And as she says to deflect the men in the final interview, some questions just don't have answers. As far as the enduring mysteries about the supernatural elements, this version of the show leaned much more into those being real. I read some interviews with Issa López and a few of the actors where they contend it's supposed to be open to the viewer's interpretation, and I suppose there are rational explanations for most of what happened, but I didn't think that's how it was being presented. As an example from the finale, Liz hears a noise and in the hall she sees a hubcap roll by. This is related to the crash that took her family, so you could say that it's a high-stress situation and she's seeing things. But that's not something we would associate with the character based on what we've seen. And in a similar scene, she finds the same gold chain that Navarro found back in episode 2, which to me works to show the difference in their reactions and to say, hey, it's Ennis. Weird, unexplainable stuff happens here. The dead really do come to visit Rose and Navarro. William Wheeler really does whistle a song that Liz has a profound reaction to. Tongues pop up in weird places. And the scientists didn't really die from freezing, but instead they were frightened to death by Sedna, or whoever the she is that B is referring to at the end. So yeah, rational explanations exist, just as there was a banal explanation for what the spiral was, a way for hunters to avoid falling through the ice. But there's also an intention that there's something in that ice, or the water below, or in the caves that's older than Ennis. Rose's explanation seemed a little on the woo side when she first delivered it, but by the end of the series it feels more accurate than what Kavak's friend told Evangeline. Plus, so much of this finale focuses on how the main characters interpret the unexplainable things surrounding the case. Navarro's belief that there's more out there takes her to a place where she finally learns her Inupiaq name. Liz's disbelief leads her to a place where she thinks she sees a trapped Holden under the ice before she falls into it. When she stops fighting, she emerges more open to Navarro's view and looks transformed when she tells her that Holden says he sees her. Of course, that connects back to the Peekaboo game that we've seen flashbacks to as one of her most enduring memories of her son. As for what happened in the final chapter, as we saw at the end of the last episode, after Hank's demise, Pete is left to clean up the mess while Danvers and Navarro follow Otis's directions to the underground ice caves. In service of changing the story of what happened to his father, he reconciles with Kayla, who sees the guy she fell in love with when she confronts him about this thing that he has to do but can't tell her about. It all felt a little disconnected from the main points the show was navigating. But his time with Rose did provide some support for Liz's transformation in the episode when she tells him that he has to put the body in the water himself. The idea being that he needs to finish what he started and close the door in order to move on at some point in the future. When he's done that, she says he probably thinks the hard part is over, but it's not. What comes after, forever, that's the worst part. And I think this works to show how even though their inability to let go comes from different places, the solution for Navarro and Danvers is the same. At the caves, they're able to enter without issue, and right away the show highlights the conflict in their beliefs when Navarro thinks she hears something calling her. After a dispute and a fall, they discover Raymond Clark, who leads them to a lab that we'll later learn is under Tsalal, and when Liz finds an instrument that made the star-shaped wounds, it's confirmed that this is where Annie died. There's a prehistoric sea creature in the ice in the shape of a spiral, and there's a chase, and after some torture, they get some answers out of Clark. He admits that Annie's death was his fault, but says he wasn't there at first when it happened. She found some notes and started to piece together what the scientists were doing at Tsalal. He tells them the same story as the teacher Adam Bryce did back in episode 2 about digging in the permafrost for a microorganism, but adds the critical detail that the pollution affected the permafrost in a way that sped up the extraction process by a lot. And when Liz says that they were falsifying the pollution numbers for Silver Sky, he explains that it was worse than that. They were actively encouraging the mine to produce more pollutants. The more waste in the water, the more waste in the ground, the better things were for their work. The story they were telling themselves, and one that was persuasive enough to get the mine on board, was that the research they were doing would save so many lives. The stillbirths and cancers that the locals experienced in the meantime were essentially a price they were willing to pay, since, they weren't the ones who had to do the paying. When Annie figured out what was going on, she destroyed their research. Lund flipped out and attacked her. All of the other scientists except Clark jumped in to help, and while he says he didn't take part and could never hurt her, we see that he was the one who finished the job smothering her when she regained consciousness after the attack. It's another example where someone's story doesn't match what we see, and in this case, he tells the story he wishes was true. When confronted with the idea that they cut out her tongue, he claims that it wasn't them and suggests that it might have been Hank, who we know the mine sent to help cover things up. You can see why he might think the only other person who knew about it would be responsible, but Hank leaving it at the crime scene before the delivery guy arrived doesn't really make sense. Later, when they talk to B, she claims they didn't take the tongue to Tsalal, so this is a mystery the show leaves open for interpretation. How did the tongue actually get there? Before they get to B and Blair, Clark shares his theory for what happened. He believed that Annie came back from the dead to kill them, which explains why he said she's awake in the opening sequence. They realize he was hiding right under them the whole time, and that he was the one that the delivery driver saw. And when they asked why he went to find Otis, he said he wanted to know how he survived his encounter with what he thinks was Annie. Danvers points out that this is impossible because Annie wasn't even born when Otis had his accident, and that leads to him dropping one of Night Country's not-so-elegant references to the first season when he says that time is a flat circle. If it's been a while, this is something that Russ picked up from Ledoux and later repeated in the present-day timeline in the first season. It comes from the German philosopher Nietzsche and is related to the concept of eternal recurrence, which states that our lives will repeat themselves exactly the same an infinite number of times because time is endless. And there's another one of those supernatural glitches where we see him later in the episode after we know that he's gone. The storm has them stuck at the research station where things get weird, which I already touched on with the hubcap incident, and eventually things get cold between Liz and Evangeline, who tries to tell her that she talked to Holden in one of her visions. Jodie Foster's performance as she lays into her partner is another high point of the finale, and this conversation is what makes her transformation matter at the end. Based on who she was and what she experienced, Liz thought that she needed for Holden's death to be a conclusion. She couldn't entertain the idea that there was something after that because it was too painful. During his interrogation, Clark had begged for them to let him die, and Navarro eventually lets him do that. He walks out in the snow and freezes much more peacefully than the other scientists. After Liz's near-death experience in the water, she keys in on what he said about holding on to the hatch, and when they look closer at that, they find Blair's three-fingered handprint on the outside that leads them to what really happened. This was a clue that was already given away in the second episode whenever we saw the handprint on the boot, and we actually see how that got there in a little bit. They go to question the crab factory worker and cleaning woman B, who we met several times throughout the season, and she tells them her story. While she was cleaning at Tsalal, she discovered the underground lab, and then they figured out that the scientist had killed Annie, rather than the mine doing it to shut her up, which is what most people believed at the time. When asked why she didn't report it, she says telling the cops would have changed nothing. It's always the same story, nothing ever happens. Which you can absolutely see where they're coming from with this. So they decided to tell themselves a different story with a different ending. This involved getting an armed group together to go abduct the scientists, take them out on the ice, make them strip, and then send them off into the cold where they eventually meet their end. When asked directly if they killed the men, she contends they did it to themselves, and the language she uses here is what leads me to believe they viewed it as letting Sedna decide. She says when they dug in her home in the ice, when they killed her daughter in there, if she wanted them, she would take them, and if not, their clothes were there for them. Her conclusion is that she must have wanted them. So if we pick that apart, Annie would be the daughter, and because of Darwin's drawing of Sedna in the first episode and all of the other references throughout the season, which if you haven't seen it, I went into the mythology involved in my episode 3 video, I think the story she's telling is one of Sedna deciding to take these men's lives. When Clark says she's awake, he's talking about Annie, because of the time they spent together in his remorse. But B is referring to the Inuit god of the sea and underworld. The actor's delivery of, I guess she ate their dreams from the inside and spit out their frozen bones, makes this one of the most memorable moments in the entire series. And the turn in the way she says it's just a story, and then pulls up Navarro's Inupiaq name and asks her what she's going to do about it, it makes it quite believable that the cops would be convinced to look the other way. I think it might have been more effective if it were just B and Blair. The other women all standing behind her felt like a little bit too much. I mean, the point is that these women have no voice, and there's no justice if they don't come together and make it for themselves. But I'm saying that was all articulated quite well through what she said. There's a fine line between advocating for a type of vigilante justice that I don't think is the message they're trying to send. This is a group of women who are reacting to the absence of justice. They're able to do that because they're overlooked by everyone else in their community. They look good standing behind her, don't get me wrong. But as I watched it again, I started to think, wait, where are they coming from? And then, oh, she's not saying, what are you going to do about it? She's saying you're not leaving here if you choose to do something. Not sure if that was the intention, so I think B on her own with just Blair there would have worked better. If not for anything else, but that it would have made her incredible delivery have a little more gravity. I do find it hilarious that they turned the BS explanation of a slab avalanche around on Kate and Conley. I mentioned in my last video how the official cause of death for the hikers at Dyatlov Pass had been changed to this same explanation, and how that infuriated all the people who'd been fascinated and investigating that strange thing that happened there for so long. So I did really like that. From there, the story jumps ahead 5 months to May, and we see Danvers being interviewed about the case where she fills in the blanks while leaving out all the important stuff that happened. In that, we learn that Navarro disappeared after she left behind a damning confession from Clark that she recorded before she let him take his own life. The implication is that Liz leaked the video, which she found under Holden's polar bear in Evangeline's empty house. We see that it's enough to shut the mine down, and Kowtowk got his SpongeBob toothbrush back, so justice has clearly been served. Of course, it's more complicated than that, but the ending has a distinct, hopeful feel to it. Pete is back with his son. Liz and Leah, who now has her permanent chin tattoo, are getting along. And if the women who abducted and sent the scientists off to meet their end were trying to let the universe fix itself, as Issa López has said they were, then things seem to be moving in the right direction. I was on board with the broad strokes of this and think it's a story worth telling. I've seen that reactions have been pretty all over the place, which isn't surprising considering the mixed reactions all season. I suppose whether they delivered a satisfying conclusion for you, for a season that was otherwise too short for my taste, will likely hinge on how you felt about this story that they were trying to tell. I landed in the middle because I liked the ideas and the mystery, but never felt fully invested in the characters, especially the further you get away from Danvers and Navarro. I've been saying it the whole time, I think 6 episodes wasn't enough, and it just made some of this stuff feel kind of awkward. There's a lot of interesting stuff that popped up throughout the season and in this episode, but some of it just doesn't make great sense if you dig into it, which I think goes back to this short, compressed format. I've mentioned the tongue for different reasons, but it turns out to be the best example of this too. I believe one of the options as far as how it got to where it was is that a supernatural force, like Sedna, was responsible for it being there. The show encourages us to imagine that this could be the case, but also there could be an equally valid, rational explanation. But if you work through that, there actually isn't. The tongue was missing when the body was found. That happened 6 years ago. You can imagine Hank cutting it out to send a message, even though that seems beyond what anyone was asking him to do, and he wasn't presented as someone who would jump at the opportunity to do something like that. I've already said it doesn't make sense for him to put it at the scene, and it doesn't really seem like it would for anyone else involved. If for some reason the women are lying at the end and they had something to do with it, I don't know how you square what their motivation throughout the entire process would be. And if you want that to feel like a valid option, you need to connect some of those dots. I didn't like it as much as people who thought it was great, but then I wasn't as bothered about it as the people who hated it either. Justice is a funny thing, and I liked how they took some of the ideas from the first season related to that and put a different spin on them. The one point that I didn't think worked was Navarro's ambiguous ending. Generally, I'm not opposed to leaving things open-ended and actually prefer it in a lot of cases. But when I watched it the first time, I just couldn't see what they were trying to do there. This ties into some of my criticisms from earlier episodes, and in particular with the way that they handled Julia's exit. In relation to Navarro, when she was asked if she survived, López says she didn't want to give simple answers. In the end, she thinks what makes a really good story is when you complete it in a way that works and makes sense for you, the viewer. This is something that I would agree with, and I kind of like the idea of Evangeline dropping out and moving on to live however she wants, to just hang out with the dead like Rose. But if that's not what happened, and that is just her spirit that lives on in Liz's memory and on her porch, is that a good ending? because that would mean that she killed herself because of mental health issues. I brought this up a couple episodes back where I was worried because I didn't like a lot of the different ways that I was imagining that it might end. And that was certainly one of the things that came to mind. It doesn't make what happened to her mother and sister seem better. And if you think it through, it's just all around sour. This leads me to believe that the ending is not, in fact, ambiguous. And having her name mean the sun returning after the darkness is more than symbolic. That's the better part of the story they were trying to tell for her, and for this place and its people. Because if you think about these protesters and their chant, "We were here before, gonna stay when you were gone," something Liz echoes when she's being interviewed, and that and her newfound acceptance of Leah getting in touch with her culture make her change more apparent. That lines up with this idea that evil comes in different forms that aren't always what you expect, and that does bring darkness, but the light can always come back. I find it easier to get on board with that rather than sometimes walking out on the ice and disappearing, as in dying, is sometimes the right answer. And I know you can say, well, it's established that this place sits on the boundary between our world and the spirit world, so maybe she just moved on to that other place, but it didn't do enough work to make that the thing that's in the front of your mind. You think of Julia, and that just feels like a strange place to go for me. And in the official podcast a while back, they explained that the Inupiaq names are related to their belief that a person never really dies. Their spirit is passed on to their child. Based on her family history and that her mom came to her in a vision to give her the name that she never got to give her before she died, I think her being alive works better than her walking to her end on the ice. The real ambiguous ending is already right there. Did Bee and the other women really think Sedna took the scientists, or is that the part that's just a story? And I think that's a great place to leave things. Please like this video if you enjoyed it. Please subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. And thanks for watching. I'll talk to you soon.